Thank you for your willingness to participate in this project. As I share with you all, as we are celebrating our 45th year, we thought it would be very helpful to just go back and capture the history from all the living past presidents. And this has really become a very exciting project, and I'm enjoying this very much. So we'll begin formally, and I will start by saying to those who may be viewing this video, I'm Ralph Johnson, and I'm the immediate past president for the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, better known as CAS. And I am speaking this afternoon with Laura, who is one of our past presidents. I'm going to ask you, Laura, to just introduce yourself and share a little bit more about who you are.
Absolutely. It's good to be here, and I share your enthusiasm. I think this is a great idea, and I'm glad you're taking the lead and CAS is doing it. One of the things to me about CAS is that it really is a reflection of so many people who've been involved over the years, and I think capturing that is great. So I'm Laura Dean. I was the CAS president from 2011 to 14. Had been involved quite a while before that. I got acquainted with CAS as a graduate student. Learned about it in the classroom, got a chance to be involved in a CAS review of Greek affairs on the campus where I was, and really just kind of fell in love with it. And also while I was a grad student, I was part of developing a new division within what was then the American Association of Counseling and Development, because ACPA was disaffiliating. And AACD, now ACA, decided that there should be a new organization for college counselors who wanted to stay in the organization. And so the American College Counseling Association got created in 91, 92. And I was part of the committee that helped formulate that. And so as I was in leadership roles with ACCA early on, I was pushing pretty hard for CAS membership. AACD was already a member, but because they incorporated so many other settings, it wasn't as specific to the goals of CAS as ACCA was. And so they decided to join, I think the second year after we were created, maybe. Phyllis was actually the first representative. She held ACCA along with other things for a little while, and then when I moved out of the presidency of ACCA, I very quickly volunteered and asked if I could be the CAS rep, and they let me. And then I stayed probably 20 years. And so it really became sort of my primary professional involvement. I became a member at large on the executive committee, and then volunteered to help Ted Miller with the SAGs. And then I became the publications editor after that, and eventually president. So long and deep involvement. It's an organization that's dear to my heart.
Absolutely. And it sounds as though you actually can go back and literally touch the founders and actively work with them. How exciting was that?
I did. It was fabulous. Yeah. I mean, when I joined, Ted, Phyllis, Bud, Carmen, that was the group that I got to know. And it meant a lot, and I learned a lot from that group.
Actually, you contributed quite a bit over those years, and we appreciate that very much. So why is CAS so important in the higher education space?
You know, CAS is important, I think, for several reasons. One, the higher education space is so broad and diverse.
Right.
And we are people who love our own professional associations, right? There's a professional association for everything. And CAS is really the one place that brings together all those perspectives around the table and attempts to capture what we believe is good practice that's broadly informed. You know, one of the things that I learned early in CAS was from Bud Thomas, who always said we have to avoid guildism. And by guildism, right? He meant the people who are in the guild make the rules and keep everybody else out, and
Right.
nobody else has influence. And for him, that was sort of the ultimate evil, is having exclusive thinking spaces and standards, right? That are only created by people who are already in the club. And so I think one of the things I became convinced about early is the power of creating standards that represent a functional area, but have been seen and contributed to by people with a lot of different perspectives. And
Right.
I just don't think that happens anywhere else. I think the other reason that it's so important is the underlying message of trust in professionals.
Right.
When you think about an accreditation model, the original two roads that diverged in the woods, and one was K-CREP and the other one became CAS.
Right.
An accreditation model says, well, take your best shot, but we'll come in and tell you if you did it right or not.
Mhm.
And CAS said, we're just going to give you the tools, and we think you're smart, hardworking people, and you can figure out what this means for you locally. We don't have CAS police. We don't,
Right.
we'll come in and try to support you, but you really should be in charge of this work on your campus in your local area. And I think that's powerful. I think offering a balance of guidance and freedom is right. And it says, we've got the most diverse higher ed system is a word I use loosely there, in the world,
Right.
right?
Uh-huh.
We've got big and small and public and private and nonprofit and for-profit. And the attempt, which is kind of, I don't know, kind of bold if you think about it, the attempt to write standards that will help everybody in all of those settings is, that's a high bar, but I think CAS for a long time has done it pretty well, so that, I spent my pre-faculty life in administration at tiny colleges. I
Right.
mean, we're talking 1,000 people, right? I had functional areas that had one person in them right out of their master's programs, a lot of them. So for the standards to be useful for me and my staffs, and also at a place like the University of Georgia, I think is sort of a genius move on the part of those who created this, and keeps a currency and a utility in the standards that has been important over time. Differently important over time, but important over time.
So do you recall some times when you actually used the CAS standards in your work while you were working in these small settings, or even when you got to Georgia in a faculty role?
Sure. In fact, in my very first job out of my doctoral program, I went to work in a small school in Indiana. And
Uh-huh.
when I got there, I discovered I was director of counseling and assistant dean. And I discovered that my predecessor as director of counseling had a role in the judicial process, the conduct process. And I knew that CAS said, no,
No.
no, no, no. And so I was able literally to take the blue book into my boss's office and say, we're not in compliance with standards. And here are some things I think we can do. I'm part of the team. I want to be helpful, but
Mhm.
can't do this. And I don't know that he was all that familiar with CAS before, but the word national standards gets people's attention.
Right.
And he was very willing to take a different look at it. So, right out of the gate, I think that gave me some leverage. I certainly, as director of counseling, I use the standards to help guide sort of planning and shifting that program, and involving the other staff in understanding what it said we should be doing and we might be doing, we must be doing. And so, I used it a lot. When I was a dean and VP, which I was for about 10 years at a couple of different schools, I used it in a couple of ways. One was always orienting new staff members. I mean,
Right.
week one of the things I asked them to do is read the contextual statement, read the standards for their area, particularly if they weren't already familiar with it, and be ready for a conversation with me about what they saw in place, where they saw gaps, where we needed to focus. Um, and I think that it gave us a common footing. For how we were going to develop those programs. And then my last institution before I came, we actually initiated CAS program reviews on a cycle for all of the functional areas under student affairs. The director of assessment for the college came and sat with me at one point and said, we've been doing great with academic program reviews. We need to start in your area. And honestly, I don't know where to start. And I literally, I mean, we were sitting at a table in my office. I literally reached behind me on a shelf,
Right.
got a blue book, and said, here, this is where we're going to start. There's a system, there's a process. And he was, I think, relieved, number one, but also excited to know that somebody had laid that groundwork that we could then use. When I got to Georgia and became a faculty member, you know, for years, one of the things our summer interns did was use the standards as a way to write sort of an overview of the office they were working in. They go all different places in the summer. Institutions they're not familiar with, sometimes functional areas they're not familiar with. And so the standards gave a more structured way for them to think about what they were seeing, because otherwise, I think, left to their own devices, they would concentrate on the things that they were interested in and not pay attention to things that maybe are a little harder to see as a summer intern. But the standards gave them a structure. It gave them a structure for conversation with their supervisors. And then later, I mean, I now for years have taught the assessment course. And so we use CAS. I also have used other pieces. You know, when I introduce in the interpersonal class, when I introduce working with individuals, we talk about the statement of shared ethical principles and how that shows up in our work. We talk about the characteristics of individual excellence and what that says in terms of what it means to be entering grad school and becoming a professional. So lots of pieces.
Lots of pieces. Very exciting to hear about that. One of the things that you said that I want to underscore is this whole notion of multiple uses of CAS. And so the governing board and members of the CAS council have capitalized on that. And we actually now have many sessions that we do at conferences titled multiple uses for CAS, so that individuals know it's not just program review, but there's so many other ways that you can utilize these resources.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's so important to get out, especially because, you know, I think when CAS first started, assessment on campuses was not where it is now.
Not at
Nobody
all.
knew what to do. Nobody had any starting places. Schools didn't have their own learning outcomes. I mean, it really served a very different purpose. And I think as things on campuses have gotten more and more sophisticated, and particularly as many campuses have their own program review process now, based in their own materials, I think it's really crucial that people understand that the standards aren't just something you do when and if you conduct a formal program review, but there's a lot of utility there.
Absolutely. Now, I'm actually curious to know what kinds of standards were being developed or were developed when you served on the council. I know I'm asking you to think and remember quite a bit there, but just
You know,
what were
I
some of the
saw
things
that
you were instrumental in?
I saw that question on the list and I thought, wow, that's a really good question. And I'm not gonna do the archaeology to truly figure that out. You know, the ones that I do remember working on the committees for the individual characteristics and the shared ethical principles.
Uh-huh.
The shared ethical principles project was one that I really loved, because what we were talking about issues of professionalization and the fact that so many groups had their own ethical statements, and everybody posting different ones in their offices or waiting rooms or whatever, we thought could sort of make it seem like none of us know what the others are doing, right? That we're all kind of on our individual orbits. And so we did it as a document analysis project. We requested that any member association that had a statement of ethics send it to us. And then we did a qualitative document analysis to see where the commonalities were. And not surprisingly, they were mostly commonalities. They used some different language at different points, but the upshot was we have more in common than we have separately. And I think that for me, it was a very CAS kind of thing to do. The other ones that stand out to me are probably ones that were tricky, right? I mean, student media was very tricky because of the issues of autonomy and ownership and independent from the institution. What was the role of an advisor? Where did institutional input become censorship? I mean, very tricky. Another one was college honor societies.
I was just thinking that because you pulled me into that one, and I chaired that committee for you.
Tricky.
Yes.
You know, and not because it's not, I mean, in some ways, I think there was more tangible need for somebody to say, hey, there are groups out there masquerading as honor societies that are not what we believe is good for students, good for practitioners, good for the world. But figuring out how to say that, and particularly, I think the issue of who we were directing, like who was supposed to use these, right?
You're right, exactly.
The deans, like who? That was a tricky one. I think also, you know, originally we had standards for I don't even remember what we called them now. Distance education, maybe.
Right.
Right. And the more that the internet became a thing and online learning became a thing, we came to a point of realizing that we needed to embed something about virtual work in the general standards. So it would show up everywhere. And it was one of the few times that we really sunsetted a set of standards.
Right.
Same thing. Originally, there were some standards about technology. And that became a section that we needed to address everywhere. So I remember those more. I remember when we created, at the time, I think it was called Sexual Assault and Relationship Violence.
Yes.
And I valued the process because of the combination of people we got to sit around the table and talk about all of the different aspects, from, you know, the women and gender studies folks to the counselors to IACLEA and the campus law enforcement and the health centers. And to me, that one so clearly touched a lot of people. And I remember watching them at meetings, really working through what we should be saying, what we could be saying. So those are some of the ones that come to mind. And then just, you know, a million revisions and updates of a million sets of standards.
And a million yet again. The time we spent delving into those standards in the old system. You know, we are so fortunate with the new system we have now.
I believe that, and I would dearly miss the old system. I philosophically, as well as I'm a word nerd, you know, I love these fun conversations. And I, you know, it certainly got to a point where it wasn't tenable, it wasn't practical, it wasn't feasible to keep up doing it like that. But I think for me, some of my richest learning around that table came from those conversations where everybody, you know, all 40 or 50 or whatever of us were trying to figure out how to say a thing that we all get behind. And there's, you know, it's the old days, but there was something about that I loved.
Right. I can certainly understand that and appreciate that as well. And you do know at this point, we have 50 sets of standards,
I know.
about to have 51.
Ooh.
And so we are, evaluating that to determine like which ones do we actually need to consider sunsetting? And are we current enough with what's happening in higher ed and the world to add new ones? So we're constantly reviewing, where we stand relative to the standards that we create and embrace and keep and sunset and all of those possibilities.
And I think those decisions are part of what makes CAS such an amazing professional development opportunity for those who are in it, because you really aren't in those conversations anywhere else.
Right.
And, particularly when I was a dean and VP, what I learned around that table about what was happening out sort of in the field broadly made me a much better administrator than I would have been if I had just known kind of what was happening on my own campus or in my own separate professional associations. So it's an amazing space to be for those who get to be in it.
Yeah. Do you recall if there were any new professional associations that joined CAS during your time on the council and or when you served as president? We sometimes have these growth spurts where we have two or three that will join, and then there are years when we don't have any new ones. So I just wondered if you might remember, but it's certainly understandable if you don't recall.
Yeah, I remember, I remember when honor societies came in. I
Right,
remember when campus stores came in. I remember when the visitor center folks came in. I wasn't president for those, but I was on the board.
right,
Um, and it really was, I think, one of the periods of growth spurt was when I got there, it was sort of student affairs and really closely connected areas, right?
correct,
The,
right,
the learning center folks were already there and that kind of thing. But I think there really was an expansion of, rather than student affairs functional areas that touch students wherever they are on campus.
correct.
And I think, when that got sort of opened up, um, we had a number join us at that point who were from areas that were a little different, but certainly meaningful and relevant.
Right, and those organizations joining CAS certainly help to underscore our philosophy that the entire university, the entire college is a learning environment for students. And indeed, they could learn while they are interacting with the dining program and the bookstore and those kinds of things. And it helps to give great intentionality to those specific areas. So we're very happy that that got started in CAS.
Absolutely. Yeah. So important.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
think it's important in both directions, right? We as traditional student affairs folks need to be more aware of those areas and how they connect. And I think for some of the folks from those areas, it was really eye-opening for them to also learn more about some of these other functional areas and what's behind them and what drives them
Right.
beyond what they might have otherwise interacted with.
Absolutely. Do you recall any particular highlights, challenges that you particularly led us through or we were in facing while you were as president and or when you were on the council?
Oh, yes. The biggest one, well, two levels, but when I was on the council when there was no executive director at all.
Yes, right.
And then Phyllis retired, moved to DC, and initially was quarter time for some ridiculously small stipend, right?
You're right.
Um, and eventually got to kind of half time. And during the time that I was president, we had come to realize that we were going to need to transition the role of the executive director. Phyllis had served well and honorably for a long time. And as much as she was not quite there, I think, mentally. I knew, right, that or emotionally knew that we were going to need to make a shift. And so we were in the midst of talking about that. And in fact, had identified Mary Beth Drexler Sharp
Right.
as the next executive director. And she was at an April meeting to observe. And, you know, one of my favorite memories is watching her sit with Phyllis and just listen and sort of respect and almost hold out her hand for the torch. I mean, it's a
Wow.
memory that I still just dearly cherish. And we didn't get to have the transition be as smooth as we had hoped because in a fairly short time, Phyllis was ill and passed, and we had not gotten there yet, which meant we didn't have any passwords. We didn't have a lot of important records. We didn't have access to the voicemail or the email, or didn't have enough signatures on bank accounts. It organizationally, it was not what you ever want to experience, and really, really hard. I mean, Mary Beth was just in the middle of her own graduation and kind of stepped in because we were all, among other things, grieving because we had
Right.
lost so suddenly.
Absolutely.
And she was a dear, dear friend to so many of us. And so Mary Beth kind of walked into this, you know, group of grieving people and an organization that had to keep going. And really had her work cut out for her in terms of figuring all that out. And so as president in the midst of that, you know, some of it was just supporting Mary Beth as the new employee to figure out what needed to be done and how to do it and start getting things in line. But the other thing that we realized through all of that is that we had spent, you know, a couple of decades or so in sort of this mom and pop homegrown fashion, but the organization was really too big and complex now to run it that way.
Right.
And so, you know, I remember a lot of time on the phone with lawyers because we realized that in the employment relationship we had not been treating that appropriately. We had been treating it as a contract stipend employee, and that was not appropriate for how we had the job description written. So we had to explore payroll and taxes and Social Security and benefits and, you know, trying to figure out employment law and how it applied to us, which then also brought up issues with the bylaws that had not been updated in ways that they needed to be, and issues around indemnity and liability and that kind of thing. So as I thought about it before we talked, one of the things that came back was how much time I was on the phone with lawyers and then working with exec to get our function in line. You know, we were also at the time, our website up until then had been a serviceable little website that some grad student at Virginia Tech had made for us. But it wasn't up to date. It wasn't up to speed. So we were also doing requests for proposals for a new website, for a management site, for accounting, for our publishing relationship. So there were all of these sort of infrastructure considerations happening, strategic planning, because clearly we were at a pivot point. And so when I think about particularly the time that I was president, that's the stuff that really stands out. I mean, yes, the work of the board was going on and we were updating standards and, you know, doing all that stuff, but it really was about sort of getting our organizational act together as the kind of organization we had grown into, but not yet made the sort of infrastructure conversion that needed to be made. So we spent a lot of time on that.
Well, again, kudos to you for having the foresight and the leadership to take us through that. And I remember many of those instances because at that point I had come onto the board and we worked quite a bit on all of those things as you laid out. So again, the foundation that was laid was built on, and then we've added to that even as we began thinking about the last 2 or 3 presidents and what they worked with because of what each of you had already put in place, and we really appreciate that. And you all were just icons to me when I came into the council and work. And you may remember I used to always tell you I just love to hear you talk about CAS. And I'd like to be able to be that articulate about CAS one of these days. I'm not sure I'm there quite yet, but you were quite a role model in that sense. And I again want to say that to you as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's funny, somebody not long ago was talking about those questions we toss around, right? And one of them was, what is there, I guess it was a faculty group, what is there that with no notes or preparation you can talk about for an hour, just off the cuff? And that was my first answer, CAS.
Right.
I can talk about CAS for as long as you want me to.
Right.
And have sometimes when somebody, faculty member has to be out suddenly and didn't plan, they're like, can you come talk about, I can talk about CAS. I may not be able to talk about anything else for that long, but I can spend as much time as you want because I really believe in it a lot. And I really am fortunate to have learned at the feet of the people who dreamed this thing up.
Right.
And that's a unique opportunity that I cherish.
So what is your assessment of CAS today? As I know that you all, as past presidents, may not be as actively involved, but we try to keep you up to date with emails and phone calls, et cetera. What have you seen lately that you're particularly happy about or proud of, or perhaps even concerned about?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is the cross-functional frameworks. I
Yes.
love them.
Yeah.
I love them a lot. And I think, they're both practical and useful, right? To say there are things that cut across areas and we have to think cross-functionally and you have to talk to people on your campus and we need to think that way. And, part of the reason that I love it is because to me, it's so reflective of the CAS philosophy.
Right.
It's always been a little funny that the CAS belief in consensus and collaboration and everybody around the table was used to create semi-siloed functional area standards. I have to, because that's the way you have to look at things. But to me, the cross-functional frameworks really speak to the CAS perspective that we need to, as often as we can, move away from siloed thinking and into horizontal understandings of how students experience things, right? One of the articles that I use with my students actually is written by Rich Keeling about an idea I probably heard him talk about first at CAS, which is we organize vertically and students experience horizontally.
Okay.
And we need to, because they don't know which office or how that looks. They just kind of go from the dining hall to the classroom to the student union to the residence hall. They experience it horizontally, and we've got to think horizontally if we want to do work that reflects and addresses the student experience. I think that's crucial. So that's one of the things certainly that comes to mind. I think, and these are small, but in my world, the graduate student packet and the faculty packet are really useful.
Yes.
And I am so grateful that CAS continues to make the grad school packet available as a free download for students, because it allows us to get stuff into their hands and show them the utility of the materials in a way that would be harder otherwise. And so I use both of those all the time. You know, I don't have as immediate a sense of the organizational functioning now, because the updates are great and they tend to focus on outputs, products, right? Which makes sense.
Mhm.
But I also realize, you know, even as a past president who pays close attention to what I see from CAS, always, right? Emails, Facebook posts, whatever. Unless I really, really stop to think about it, it's sort of hard to I don't know, get my hand around.
Gotcha.
And then I think, I mean, CAS has always had this interesting challenge of, you know, we're represented in 50 professional organizations. And you walk down the hallway at any given professional conference and ask people what they know about CAS, and the answers are not always what I would like to see them say,
I hear you.
right?
Right.
I think we've never been as visible, as top of mind, as sort of daily in your face with people as I wish we were. And now that I'm not actively involved anymore, I see that more. And
I
it,
understand what you're saying.
you
Right.
know, and it makes me always think, okay, how do we continue to crack that? And one of the challenges always has been the business model, because we're dependent on selling materials, which means we can't just give the standards away for free like a member, individual membership organization with conferences. You know, they give more of their materials away for free because the business model is we make money off your membership and your conference registration.
Correct.
And
Exactly.
CAS doesn't have that. And so that, I think, has always been and continues to be a challenge. The one other thing that comes to mind is, and this is both, I think, an advantage, maybe not advantage, but it's a disadvantage and maybe a quasi advantage. And that is because of costs and because of the pandemic, knowing that the group only is together once a year now, I think it in person, right, is tough, because CAS, I think, is benefits from rich relationships and people knowing each other.
Hmm.
And I think the speed of turnover of representative appointments, which is very different now than it was earlier, and the fact that people just, they're not hanging out at breaks and going out to dinner and taking walks. And I think it becomes more of a challenge to have the rich exchanges. And you know, some of that's friendship, right? Social friendship. But some of it is, how do you do this on your campus? Here's how I do this on my campus. Here's what we're up against. How are you working with that?
Hmm.
Those exchanges, I think, are just harder virtually. There's not the, you know,
It's not the same level of depth
no,
in the
no,
conversation. As much as you try, it just isn't quite there.
right. It's not like standing in line for the lunch buffet with somebody and striking up a conversation, right? There has to be a different level of intentionality. And I think that I don't want to say I'm concerned about it. That makes more of it than I think there is. But I do think that CAS benefited when there was more time for people to be together. And so now it's just a challenge to figure out, how do we, or do we, try to fill that back in a little bit. because without it, I think the work becomes a little more transactional, a little more
Mhm.
task-based. You know, we need to do this. We've got a committee for that. They've reported that sounds good. Let's vote for that. And I wonder, and I don't know, but I wonder if more limited time as the representative and less time engaging um, means that fewer people sort of absorb it at a deep level. Um, that,
Definitely understand what you're saying.
yeah,
And we still have those conversations around the governing board table, a little less around the council table, but certainly the governing board, we are looking at all those, and we are certainly wedged between a rock and a hard place
absolutely.
because it does help associations financially when they
Yep.
only have to send someone once a year.
Yes.
But I do believe that the conversations are not as rich as they used to be. And the opportunities for that impromptu learning moment that pops up when you are sitting next to each other or walking down the hallway, those are missed. But the good thing is that the quality of the work are that we're putting out, we think is still there.
Right.
Yeah.
It is.
Yes.
And I really, I commend CAS for figuring out how to maintain the quality of the work when the circumstances in which the work is being done are so different.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm describing is what any alumni describes who had a great experience at their school and
Yes.
comes back and they're like, wait, what? You don't you don't do that anymore? That building got knocked down? You don't, what do you mean you don't have that lecture series? That was, that was it. That was the thing. And I think any of us who work in higher ed have to realize that that the bones change
Yes.
generationally.
Exactly.
And then one of the challenges of leadership, like you just said, is how do we still convey culture? How do we still, convey values and philosophy and some of those kind of fuzzy, intangible things, but that infuse the work and have infused the work since the beginning. And it doesn't have to look the same, right? If
Right.
it did, we would all be silly people on our campuses trying to prevent change. And that's the last thing that student affairs people ought to be about.
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
but I think it's important, and I'm glad to hear you talk about those conversations of how do we help people see it, get it, sort of embrace it, because those people then become um, the conveyors out there. If there's a problem with um, not as much visibility as we'd like, then we need more true believers out there saying, wait, there's a thing, there's a process, there's a group, there's a CAS answers that question, and you need to know about it. And I think the more, like in anything, the more engaged people are in the deeper senses of engagement, right? Koo and his folks would remind us that it's engagement is not just what they do, it's what we create opportunities for them to do. It's an institutional resource allocation as well as an individual effort. And I think that's got to come together to reimagine engagement and maybe eventually open up engagement. I mean, that I've thought for a long time, it would be good if people weren't limited to having a CAS experience only if their own group picked them as the one to send, right? Because then I think there are other people who would love to find a way to connect and help and engage and whatnot. But the historical structure makes that harder. Um, and I think there are individual organizations that have, I think, made a good effort at that themselves.
Mhm.
But I think if there were more of a way to do that, that might help kind of break the shell a little bit too.
It's really tough, again, with that balance. Uh, but as I said, the good thing is, and I'm going to tease you a little bit when I say this, that we're still promulgating standards. That we used to joke with you about your
Favorite
love of the
word.
word promulgate.
Ted Miller word, we don't want to lose it.
Don't want to lose it. Don't want to. Well, as we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything that I should have asked that I didn't ask as we just come to the end of our conversation?
Think I put some notes together, so I'm just going to look over here and see if there's anything that I meant to talk about that I didn't. I think one thing that I've been thinking quite a bit about lately is, and this comes from a couple of questions my students asked, like, what purpose was CAS created to serve? And is that purpose still relevant?
Mhm.
And I think that it's an important question because when CAS was created, it was blank slate, right? I mean, it was a time when everybody was kind of doing their own thing, both in prep programs and in practice, and there was no real guidance for good practice, what good practice looks like, and people really didn't have a sense of how to assess anything, right? And at the
Right.
time, assessment was very inputs oriented. I remember SACS COC regional accreditation stuff at the time was the same, right? And there's a reason the original SEGs looked like the SACS accreditation criteria because Ted Miller was working on both of them at the same time.
Right.
But at the time you were doing a campus study for accreditation and you were answering how many books in the library, how many beds in the residence hall, how many people had PhDs, and that was supposed to be some indicator of quality, right? So initially it was, we just need to get this down, like figure out what the standard is, what the guidelines are, and then give people kind of a workbook to figure it out. Well, from then until now, the sophistication of assessment work in higher education is just night and day different. The materials that have been produced since then, Learning Reconsidered came out. The fact that the accreditation agencies and every institution now has outcome statements that they've developed on their own and ways that they've decided to assess them. We've got people coming out of graduate programs or professional association institutes well-trained to do assessment. So CAS, I absolutely am convinced, still plays a role, but the role is different. The role is not, you don't know how to do this, so we're going to teach you, right? The role is, we have a sense of the work that's informed by a process and a set of eyes that's really important. And that goes beyond what you can possibly develop locally, even if all those other things are in place. Even if you are an assessment whiz kid and your institutional effectiveness office is on top of its game, and even if all those things are true, CAS is still value added. And here's why. And I think it's important to continue to refine the messaging, because I think people who've been in the field a long time think of it perhaps in a way that doesn't give credit to the current landscape of assessment. And I think that's a piece that needs to be continually sort of turned around and thought about in terms of, you know, what do people already have these days? And what are we adding to that?
Well, I am very happy to indicate to you that we are really focusing on that in a way, in a very intentional way that really helps convey that to the profession. We have really focused in on assessment. We're really clear about our role in helping to facilitate student learning, development, and success. In order to do that, we have to have some sense of what outcomes we're expecting, then how do we measure those? So we're having those conversations in a much more intentional and deeper way as a result of what's going on in higher education in general. So I'm happy to know that we're on top of that in that sense.
Absolutely.
You know, as we close out, I want to thank you again, Laura. You've spent a tremendous amount of your professional life making significant contributions to CAS. And what has become my closing tagline to everyone in these conversations, I want to thank you for receiving the baton from Susan and then passing it on to Deb and leaving that legacy of dedication and work and just overall quality. I can't thank you enough on behalf of all of the member associations and all of the council members who worked very hard to sustain this legacy of CAS. Appreciate you and thank you again.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I continue to be so impressed by the work and so proud of CAS and proud to have been affiliated with it. So I'm glad you're doing this. I can't wait to watch all these.